3 neophytes kneeled before me, hands on their knees and foreheads pressed to the floor. I walked down the line, pulling up their shirts to bare their backs, skin unblemished by scars. The Cat O'Neill tail swung heavily in my hand. The cold steel handle and barbs glinted in the dim light overhead. "You are all sinners," I said. The woman on the far right shuddered, and the man before me shook with silent sobs. I shoved him down with my boot, driving his face further into the dirt floor. "Michael, will you take this chance to confess?" I ground my boot on his head. The man kept snivelling, refusing to answer my question. I rubbed the flail in my hand. "Priestess, please," he wailed, trying to raise his head to look at me. I slammed it back into the dirt before he could. "Do you not want to be forgiven?" "It's okay, Michael," I assured him, lifting my foot. Michael obeyed, prostrating further. "I was greedy, priestess. I stole wine from a storehouse and drank it until I passed out. I am a sinner. I accept my punishment." Michael dripped with sweat. He was sincere. It gave me hope that his soul could be saved. "How many lashes do you deserve, Michael?" I trailed the barbs across his back. I believe 5 is fair," he responded. That poor, weak man. "No, Michael. 5 is not fair. For your cowardice, you will receive 15. I raised the flail overhead, the vicious barbs dangling at the ready. "Forgive me," Michael begged. I ignored him and gritted my teeth. I had to be strong. I was their shepherd, but it hurt me to hurt my people. The barb swished through the air, hitting his back with a sickening smack. Each barb dug into his flesh, dragged along his skin. Michael howled in pain, arcing his head to the ceiling and balling his fists. Fresh tears spilled from his eyes. 9 droplets of blood trickled down his back, leaving a bright trail like raindrops on a window before pooling on the floor. "That's 1. Put your head back down." I grabbed his hair and forced him down, ignoring his desperate, incoherent pleas. The other 2 sinners had their eyes closed, quivering in fear. Some blood splattered onto my pure white robes, but I couldn't afford to be snobby when I had such important work. I hit Michael again, sending him reeling. As I continued to wail on him, his screams grew louder. After the 8th strike, Michael toppled over unconscious. "I'll have mercy on him." I walked over to the woman. "Camilla, will you confess your sins before your brothers and sisters?" I wiped the blood off, leaving red hand trails across my robes. "Yes, priestess. I was a fool. I was slothful. I forgot to feed the cattle for 2 days. I deserve whatever you decide to do with me." She kept her composure through her confession. Her maturity astounded me, bringing a tear to my eye. "How many lashes, Camilla?" 20, she replied, bowing even deeper until she lay flat on the ground. It brought a smile to my face, like a proud mother. "You will endure 3 lashes. Prepare yourself." I raised the flail once more. "I will never forget your mercy," she whispered, head buried in the floor. I brought the flail down on her back. She shrieked, causing Lewis, the man next to her, to wince in empathetic pain. I made the following 2 lashes a little less than full strength. Camilla was left face first on the ground, barely clinging to the waking world. My boots squished in the puddle of blood created by Michael and Camilla's wounds. The dirt turned to mud, a squishy, vicious substance. "And finally, Lewis, tell me, how have you sinned?" I shook the mud off my boot and stood over his prostrated body. "I beg your forgiveness, priestess. I spoke with the cattle before integrating them." He hung his head in shame. "Yes, that is a most severe sin. You ignored our pledge to remain pure, breaking time-honored traditions with reckless disregard for your brothers and sisters. I'm sorry, priestess. Spare me. Your foolish child will live a life of devotion. Lewis clenched his hands in front of him in prayer, but this profanity mocked me. How many lashes, Lewis? I hung the barbs in his face, forcing him to watch his family's blood trickle from the spiked steel. Lewis tilted his head to meet my gaze, but his disrespect was met with the sole of my shoe, slamming him back into his place. Answer! 50! No, 70! He said back through the tears and snot. It was a shame. After everything I'd done, Lewis still took me for a fool. He watched Camilla's bravery and thought he'd see the same result if he faked a devotion. If you're so eager for punishment, I'll grant your request. 70 it is. I readied the flail over his exposed back. Lewis's eyes widened, and he stammered sounds that didn't quite turn into words. Camilla had covered her eyes and pressed her body against the floor. Michael was still unconscious. Camilla, I hissed, you must watch. How else will you remember this lesson? Camilla lifted her muddied face and fixated on the scene. Good. Now that I had my audience, there was work to do. I brought the flail down with all my might, lacerating his flesh. Lewis's screams were the loudest. No matter how long I beat him, he never stopped filling the room with his symphony of agony. It took 10 minutes. I had to rest 3 times when I grew too fatigued to keep swinging. As pitiful as he was, Lewis never passed out until the final strike. Surely, the exalted would forgive them. Their suffering would not go unrewarded by our God. Come here. I beckoned Camilla and Lewis to me, dropping to my knees. Michael stirred awake, and I gestured for him to crawl to me. Once all 3 gathered around me, I wrapped my arms around the group and drew them close. Their blood smeared onto my robes and skin, but I welcomed the intimacy. We are the believers. We are family. I kissed their foreheads one by one and stood. Camilla, get this place cleaned up and tend to the others. I have work to do. Oh, and I'm proud of you. The exalted cherishes the righteous children. I hung the flail on the wall, where it would wait patiently until the next time sin emerged among my flock. Yes, priestess. She bowed deeply. I left the room of penance and walked across the compound for worship. We ran a beautiful farm. Luscious stalks of golden wheat swayed gently in the warm breeze. The sun was bright overhead, beating down while giving wonderful life to our crops. Our vegetable garden flourished, and the squash was the largest I'd ever seen. This tiny home, nestled in a remote village in South America, was built around the discovery of the exalted 2 years prior. After nearly a decade of searching, painstaking voyages, and unending poring over old, obsolete records, everything finally pointed me here. When I'd pinned down its location, I'd gathered a handful of colleagues who shared my interests. The area where we kept the cattle was nothing more than an aluminium shed, the size of a studio, locked with a hefty deadbolt. I approached the shed and grabbed the keys. The usual slurping and moaning were barely audible outside, the sound seeping through the little gaps between the walls and the roof. After quickly checking my surroundings, villagers occasionally wandered into the compound by accident or to steal our vegetables. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. Inside the feeding and workshop room, I never got used to the smell. As much as we tried to mask it, the stench of rot and waste assaulted my nose. Lining the walls were 16 men and women, primarily adults, caught in a trance, their hands locked in steel cuffs on the ceilings. They dangled and twisted to and fro, their bodies flaccid. pained, slow moans would escape their mouths before they went back to their laboured breathing. Each of them had a small, fleshy tube that pierced the space between their eyeballs and eye sockets, jammed deep into their heads. Those were the cattle. Those ghastly, sickly husks were the sustenance for our god. In the middle of the room, the exalted emerged from a pit on the floor in all its glory. The tubes all led back to its fleshy body. It was a mass of inhumane muscle that undulated and wreathed sporadically. Hundreds of tubes of various sizes and shapes extended from its body, some of which ran into the cattle. Orifices that looked like hookworm mouths covered the exalted, with long, jagged teeth surrounding the entrance. It had many eyes on its surface, small and beady irises that darted around the room, and all fixated on me when I stepped inside. That was the being I had chased for a decade. Few of its kind existed. Some said they fell from the sky in meteors. Others said they sprouted from the ground. To my initial shock, it turned out to be real. But every time I found the source of the rumor, it would be nothing more than a dead husk by the time I arrived with my team. I didn't plan on worshipping the creature. I was merely a researcher at the time, but it sent images into my mind when I made contact. It showed me a world beyond comprehension, promising to take me there if I served it. All it asked for was food. It was starving, dying slowly of malnutrition. Luckily, I had food to spare. Of our original quintet, Dylan, a grad student, had the misfortune of being entangled with its appendages. He was the first cattle, and the exalted was not satiated. I showed my remaining colleagues the truth, and thus our compound was founded. "Oh, exalted, how may I serve you?" I dropped to one knee before it. It spoke in vague images and psychic impressions. The exalted sent a discontentment to me and an image of the cattle. I looked around the room closer and spotted a woman on the far wall who would no longer blink, her body now lifeless. The exalted sucked all the liquid from her. Her skin looked like the surface of a raisin. How did I miss this? "Forgive me." I slammed my forehead to the dirt in front of the exalted. "I was negligent. Please, punish me. I was careless. I am a worthless servant." Tears poured from my eyes. The weight of the guilt drove me further into the floor. How could I have been so stupid? The exalted sent images of new cattle replacing the dead woman. "Yes, right away. I promise I will never let you down again." My God forgave me. The exalted was merciful, better than I deserved. A worthless person like me had no right to serve something so benevolent, but I made it my duty, and I would stand by my God even beyond the day I died. What was I supposed to do with the body? That was the first time one of the cattle had died. We weren't under much scrutiny from the villagers. After all, we'd been snatching them away for over a year without any of them noticing. It came to me that cattle weren't the only animals we raised. There were 6 pigs on the farm willing to eat whatever I put in front of them. The exalted wouldn't appreciate waste. Why bury the dead cattle when I could use the bodies to sustain more life? I slung the corpse over my shoulder effortlessly. She must have weighed as much as an elementary schooler, and lugged her body to the butchery room back in the compound. The butcher room was nice and cold. Carcasses of pigs hung on racks, and slabs of raw meat lined the fridge shelves. I flopped the drained husk onto the butcher table and grabbed the sharpest cleaver. Now, Michael usually took care of things like this, but with his penance, I doubted he could manage it. I lined up my swing, aiming to slice off from the knee to the toes. With a mighty swish, the blade severed the bottom half of her leg. The moment the blade met her skin, she sharply gasped and shot up at the table. The woman wailed a terrible, weak sound. I screamed with her, the cleaver flying from my hand onto the floor. Blood spurted from the wound, covering my face. She tried to hoist herself off the table, but her arms were too weak even for that. I fell to the floor and scrambled around for the cleaver. The blood clouded my vision. After pouring around for a few seconds, I found the blade. The woman lost the strength to scream. She clutched at her wound and cried while praying softly in Portuguese. I couldn't make out most of it as she slurred, stumbling over words. I hoped whatever god she called on heard her. I tried to tell myself she was nothing more than food. But watching her breathing slow and her eyes lose their light filled me with disgust for myself. "I'm sorry. This is all for a greater cause. Thank you for providing sustenance to the exalted," I said, raising the cleaver over her. I'd rather put her out of her misery than force her to die slowly of blood loss. I slammed the blade through the flesh of her neck until it hit her spine. There was a moment of shock where her body spasmed, but she soon died without issue. I wiped the blood from my brow and tried to steady my breathing. Something shuffled behind me, and I turned to find Lewis, freshly bandaged, witnessing everything I'd done. He looked at me, petrified in shock, and threw up on the floor. I put the cleaner down on the table. "Lewis," I started, but he ran off before I could finish. It took a few minutes, but eventually I regained my bearings, remembered my purpose, and diced her corpse into tiny pieces to make pig feed. I didn't have time to mourn. We were short of one cattle, and the exalted would starve if I couldn't find another. I finished for the day and knew it would be a fitful rest for all of us. The next day, I brought Camilla with me for our trek into the village, where we would trade our vegetables and meat for things like gas and sugar. We loaded the cart and wheeled off to the dirt road to make the 5-mile journey to the nearest inhabited area. Lewis must have told her about what happened yesterday. There was a growing distance between us. "Camilla, do you know why we're all here?" I asked as we walked along. "We're here to carry out the Exalted's will, so that it can bring eternal prosperity," she answered. Her steps were heavy and her voice flat. "Yes, that's true. But aside from that, we're here for our own reasons. My life before serving the Exalted was nothing more than biding time. So many people live without purpose, and so many accept that. I want to be part of something bigger than myself, sure, but I also want to matter. This is how I've come to matter, leading our family, loving the Exalted," I told her. The way she looked at me changed. "I feel the same. Sometimes I question it, but I don't think I made the wrong choice. Thank you, priestess." She smiled at me. We walked on in silence, a little lighter. When we reached the village, we moved our cart up to the usual spot and set up shop. But I had other goals besides selling goods. I was on the lookout for fresh cattle. The locals were quite naive. Most were lured to the compound by requests for an odd job or promises to trade livestock. Fewer people visited our stand, and they looked wary of us. I picked up the occasional whisper. They thought of us as bad luck, with all the disappearances happening around when we arrived and set up the compound. After being ignored most of the afternoon, we were prepared to leave when a child, around 8 years old, approached Camilla and clung to her clothes. "Hello, how can I help you?" she asked, but the boy didn't reply. Camilla repeated the question in Portuguese, and he asked for corn. Camilla asked where his parents were, and he replied that he had none. When she grabbed an ear from our cart, I stopped her. "Tell him we have better corn back at the compound, roasted and with butter." Camilla's face fell. She audibly gulped and wiped the sweat from her face before squatting down to the boy's level and gave him my message. He smiled and nodded, following along with us, never letting go of Camilla's dress. The boy would try to chat with Camilla, but her words came out in stammers. Arriving at the compound, Lewis spotted us coming in with the boy. He looked at Camilla, and she hung her head, avoiding his eyes. "Tell him to come inside. I'll get dinner started." I went to the pantry, grabbed corn, and fired up the grill. He needed to be well fed if he were to provide proper nutrients. I killed the weak part of myself that thought of the boy as a human child. He was cattle, food, nothing more. By the time the food was ready, Camilla had stopped responding to the boy completely. He sat in her lap at the table. I placed the corn in front of him. He squealed in delight. It had probably been days since he had last had a proper meal. Michael wasn't there for dinner, and I hadn't seen Michael around the compound. According to Camilla, his wounds from the lashing were infected. The boy was halfway through devouring the plate of corn when he grew dizzy. He swayed in Camilla's lap, grumbling something before falling face first into the table, knocking his meal to the floor. Lewis inched away from me toward the exit. "Lewis, take him. We're going to the feeding room." Lewis stopped in his tracks and approached me, eyes fixed on the floor. He scooped the boy into his arms and led me to the exalted, moving at a snail's pace. "Lewis, hurry. The boy could wake up at any moment." I spurred him on. Instead of heeding my words, Lewis stopped. "Priestess." He turned around but refused to make eye contact, like a child ready to be scolded. "What is it, Lewis?" My patience wore thin. Every second we delayed, the exalted grew hungrier. We had already failed in our collective duty to honor and satiate it, and Lewis dared delay things further. Are you sure the exalted would be satisfied with a child?" His voice quivered, and he cowered as he spoke the worst, expecting another lashing. "He's so small, he'd hardly have the nutrients the exalted needs. Maybe we could let him go for now and find better cattle, right?" Lewis rushed through his words, tripping over the syllables. "Lewis, it's not that I want to disobey you. I would do anything for the exalted. Haven't I proven that? All I'm saying, Lewis!" I raised my voice and lunged towards him. Lewis flinched, shielding himself and drawing the boy close to his chest. "Don't test me, Lewis. This is the exalted's will. Everything we do is by its desire, and it grants us everything we have by its mercy. You're one of us, Lewis. Don't betray the love and conviction we share." Lewis thought for a moment, then nodded and walked toward the feeding room with a quicker step. I unlocked the heavy double doors to the exalted's chamber and pushed them open, revealing the cattle and our god. The cattle looked to be in better shape. After returning to their regular feeding schedule, their bodies looked less emaciated, and some color had returned to their skin. I led Lewis over to the empty shackles of the husk I had disposed of the day before. "You know what to do," I told Lewis. He took the boy by his wrists and hoisted him up to lock him into the restraints. The cuffs clicked shut, and the boy was left dangling from the chains on the ceiling. The exalted noticed our presence and the new cattle we brought. It sent its emotions into my head: eagerness, hunger, and impatience. "We won't keep you waiting another moment, my lord." I stood by the mass of flesh, teeth, and tentacles and bent down. I reached my hand down to the biggest orifice on its body, narrowly avoiding the ring of wicked sharp teeth. Once I was elbow deep in its body, I withdrew one of its feeding tubes. It was slimy and warm, but it didn't fill me with disgust. It was like warm lotion on my skin, a luxury spa treatment. Lewis couldn't watch. He never took part in connecting the cattle to the exalted, but I would forgive the insult. The tube stretched with me as I walked to the hanging child. Slime dripped from it onto the floor, creating sticky, slippery puddles. I faced the boy with the tube in my hand. Lewis was shrinking back towards the door. Lewis, you do the honours. I offered him the tube. He could consider it a test, a way to make up for his recent behaviour.
Oh, priestess, I couldn't possibly take away the privilege.
Take the tube, now. I walked to him and thrust it into his hands. He nearly dropped it to the floor. I dragged him to the shackled boy.
Right there.
I pointed at the boy's skull. Just between the eyeball and the bone. Thread it through and jam it in. I took his hand and guided him to the right spot. His hands shook, and he struggled to keep a hold on the tube. I waited for him to act, silently locking him in an oppressive stare. It took him nearly a minute before he gulped and shoved the tube in. There was a squishing noise as the tube pushed aside the eye and embedded it in the boy's skull. Further, I ordered. Lewis gagged, covering his mouth and forcing down bile with his free hand. The tube slid deeper and stopped when it hit its destination. As soon as it met the brain, the boy's eyes shot open, now spasming while screaming his lungs out. Startled, Lewis stumbled backward, crashing to the floor, covering his face and curling into a ball. This happened occasionally. It wouldn't last long. The exalted would shut off those brain functions in a few seconds. Until that happened, the boy continued to wreathe, his shrieks ringing in my ears. That moment was always the hardest. Those final cries, the last fight they would give. It was difficult to think of them as cattle at that moment. Before I humoured that pang of regret, the exalted broadcast its contentment into my head, sending images of beautiful foreign scenery, a promised land that pacified me.
Get up, Lewis.
I seized his arm and dragged him to his feet. He was shaky, and he held back tears. I wrapped him in a hug, which he returned.
You did good. I know it was hard, but I'm proud of you.
I stroked his back until he seemed calm enough. Grabbing his hand, I led him out of the feeding area. We went our separate ways back to the compound. I met Camilla in the kitchen.
Did everything go well, priestess? You look tired. Thank you for your concern. Everything went as well as it could have, but I worry for Lewis. Sometimes I doubt his devotion. I wouldn't worry too much, priestess. He's young and a bit soft. He'll learn. I suppose. Where has Michael been? I haven't seen him in a while.
Camilla shifted uncomfortably, her eyes shifting around the room.
Oh, he's sick. I've been tending to him. Nothing to worry about. Just a mild infection that we nearly have under control.
She looked back at me and smiled through pursed lips.
Is that so? Well, I hope to see him again soon. We're running low on pork.
I left Camilla behind and made my way to my room.
Good night, Camilla,
I called back.
Good night, priestess.
On the way to my room, I passed Michael's, cracking the door to peek inside. He faced the wall opposite the door and seemed to be asleep. Satisfied, I retired to my quarters. With the day's chaos, it took me a while to get to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, memories of the child's screams sent me jolting back awake. No, not the child. He was cattle, nothing more. After nearly 2 hours, my body finally relaxed. I nestled my head into my pillow and waited for slumber. Just as I was about to drift off, a barrage of images and emotions assailed my mind. I fell out of bed, my brain screaming in pain from the information overload. I saw furious colours and vaguely humanoid figures burning. The exalted sent rage, confusion, and betrayal. Without delay, I dashed into the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife I could, and shouted for my fellow believers.
Everyone, get up! The exalted is in danger! Come with me to the feeding room.
Nobody responded. I didn't even hear stirring, but there was no time. I sprinted to the feeding room, knife in hand, ready to do whatever it took to protect my god. The doors were already open. But that should have been impossible. I kept the keys on me at all times. I checked the pockets I had sewn onto my robes. They were gone. When could anyone have gotten their hands on the keys? Only one time came to mind: the hug with Lewis. I gripped the knife tighter, begging, praying that what I feared wouldn't come to pass. I burst through the double doors. Before my disbelieving eyes, Michael and Lewis were freeing the cattle one by one. Both of them froze at my entry. Lewis had the child in his arms, and Michael was withdrawing a tube from one of the cattle's eyes. The exalted made guttural growls and feral noises from its many mouths. Tentacles sprouted from its body and thrashed around, whizzing through the air.
Michael, Lewis, what are you?
They had to have an explanation.
Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me I'm wrong. I'm sorry, priestess,
Lewis said through tears and snivelling.
I never meant to hurt you. I just couldn't take it anymore.
Lewis collapsed to the floor in tears, hugging the unconscious child like a stuffed animal.
We've gone too far, priestess. I won't let anyone else get hurt.
Michael dropped the tube and stepped toward me.
After everything, you would still betray me. My children. My foolish children.
I brandished the knife, forcing my body to stay still and resolute. Tears welled in my eyes. Michael took another step forward.
These are real people. What is this thing we've been worshipping? What has it ever done for us?
Michael screamed.
You have so little faith, Michael. You can't see the grand design. I'm sorry. I wish I had taught you better.
It gouged out my heart. How could I have let them go so far astray? I was their leader, their priestess, and I couldn't show them the truth. In my moment of weakness, Michael barreled toward me. I barely had time to lash out, driving the knife into his shoulder. It sank deeply, catching on his shoulder muscle. Michael roared in pain, but followed through with the surprise attack, pinning me to the ground.
I have no choice,
he shouted, spittle flying into my mouth. Michael wrapped his hands around my neck and squeezed. His vice grip crushed me, and stars clouded my vision. I kicked and thrashed, but he kept squeezing.
Priestess!
Camilla cried out from behind me.
Camilla, wait!
Michael shouted. Camilla let out a battling cry and jammed a knife into Michael's chest. He fell backward, clutching at the wound and sputtering.
Priestess, here!
Camilla helped me to my feet and supported me with her shoulder. Lewis had hidden himself from the conflict, curling into a ball and covering his ears. A large tentacle shot out from the exalted's body and wrapped itself around Lewis's leg.
Wait!
Lewis wailed, clawing at the tentacle.
Help, priestess! Camilla!
The exalted dragged him through the dirt toward its awaiting maw. The largest orifice had expanded wide enough to swallow a person. Camilla lurched forward to help him, but I caught her arm and held her back. Lewis's leg slipped inside the exalted's mouth. The teeth clenched it, severing it at the knee. Lewis shrieked, thrashing like a fish in a net. The exalted pulled him deeper, chewing him apart, one bite at a time. His scream stopped when the teeth reached the torso. After only a minute of struggle, Lewis was in the exalted's gullet. Camilla emptied her stomach onto the ground next to me. She shook with sobs and fell to her knees. I bent down to meet her.
It's okay, Camilla.
I rubbed her back and held her tight.
Thank you. You'll never turn on me, Camilla. I know it now.
Camilla raised her head to the room, to the cattle, Michael's corpse, and the puddles of Lewis's blood.
Never, priestess,
she assured me between sobs.
I promise I'll never let you down like I did them. We are the believers. We are righteous. We are family. Do you understand? Yes, priestess.
She buried her face in my chest. I don't know whether I was convincing her or myself. But I would be strong. I would not waver. It was far too late for that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.